Ascension EAP, Recovery and Resilience, Moving Through Trauma to Growth and Well-Being. Portions of this series were filmed at St. Anthony's Retreat Center in Marathon, Wisconsin.
Hi, my name is Rayanne Thomas, and I'm the director of Ascension Wisconsin EAP. I hope you've had a chance to listen to the We Care series. In that original series, we talked about compassionate presence and response to help each other get through difficult times. We'll take those ideas now and apply them to our next phase, recovery and resilience. I'm excited to tell you how these principles can be applied to ourselves to enhance our own well-being in this next series on recovery and resilience. So we'll talk today about the importance of self-care for resilience. We're going to talk a little bit about stress and trauma so that people understand the difference between normal stress and trauma. And we'll talk about how our bodies react to stress and trauma. Sometimes we get so busy in our head thinking about things that we forget that we're a physical being as well, and we have physical reactions to stress. In addition to that acknowledgement of what people have been through, we're going to talk a little bit about hope, validate what you've been through, and offer you some hope. Eleanor Brown is a famous novelist, and she said that when you take time to replenish your spirit, it allows you to serve others from the overflow. She says that you cannot serve from an empty vessel. Look, listen, and link were the three concepts that we introduced in the We Care series. And they're very simple because that makes them easy to remember. So look is all about looking about what's around you, what's happening, who might need help. Is it safe? All kinds of things like that. In this series, we're going to talk about look from the perspective of looking at what you've been through, how you're coping. And it really is about noticing, just how you're doing. The listen part is listening to what you need right now and attending to that. And then link, that's the good one, that's the fun one, finding those resources that can help you get back to resilience. Let's start with look. This is a pretty little spot to sit down and talk about look. Perfect. So when we talked about look in the We Care series, we talked about looking at your surroundings, noticing people who were maybe needing a little bit more support. In this resilience and recovery series, we're talking about look from a little bit more of a metaphorical place. Look at what you've been through. Look at the things that you've experienced over the past weeks or months. Look at how you're doing right now and noticing how your coping may have evolved and maybe not kept up with all of the things that you've experienced. Yeah. So I want to talk just a little bit about trauma. This is a great time to bring that up. I think when we work with patients, we think about trauma for those patients, but we don't always realize that some of what they've gone through can feel traumatic to us. So trauma is exposure to events or stimuli that make you feel a little bit threatened or maybe even unsafe or concerned about your own well-being. Not only can our patients be traumatized, but we can be traumatized by what we experience in our workplace. Witnesses to trauma, bystanders even, can be traumatized. And I think sometimes we need to keep in mind that trauma-informed care doesn't just apply to the people that we take care of and that we want to be helpful to. It also applies to our own well-being.
So how can we use trauma-informed care to help ourselves? Help me. How can I use that?
Yeah. Those same principles that exist for trauma-informed care when we're applying care to others work very well for ourselves. Those principles are realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. So it's all about realizing, stepping back and looking at what you've been through,
recognizing that you probably had some trauma lately, or at least some distress lately, and maybe even some distress and trauma in your past that might kind of resurface as you are working through things now. Then responding, and that means taking good care of yourself, responding to your own needs, and then resisting re-traumatization. And what I mean by that, when we talk about applying that personally, is thinking about purposeful interaction, not exposing yourself to trauma that you don't need to be exposed to. So it's putting some boundaries there and maybe protecting yourself a little bit so that that you're not going through things you don't have to go through. Healthcare workers are helpers, they're healers, and sometimes our system has called them heroes. I think that's a really cool thing, but we need to be careful about that because we never hear about Superman going to talk to a best friend, or hanging up his cape and getting a massage, or taking a day to take care of himself. But as healthcare workers, we need to do that. We are not Superman, and we need to apply some self-care to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. We are maybe heroes, but we should not be martyrs. We should not get used up by all this trauma. One thing that I want to bring up around this trauma-informed care idea is the idea that it's really a mind shift. It's about looking at things maybe from a little bit different paradigm. Healthcare professionals have very high standards most of the time, and that makes them excellent providers, but it also makes them a little bit hard on themselves. So when we're looking at those standards, we need to kind of shift some of our own self-talk. That mind shift is about taking negative self-talk and maybe reframing that as a more helpful belief system. I am sick might evolve into, I've been through a lot. Or I'm weak, I need to talk to somebody, might evolve into, I've been through a lot, but I've survived it, and I've come out a stronger person on the other side. So that mind shift is an important thing, and we want to talk about that, or acknowledge that, I would say, when we talk about trauma-informed care.
Okay, so is trauma-informed care all there is to it?
Oh, there are a lot of terms, and we won't go deeply into all of them, but I think it's important just to acknowledge that these different conditions or terms or states exist because you've probably heard them before. So the first is post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a diagnosable disorder, and this series is not about diagnosing anybody, but it is about acknowledging what you've been through and attending to yourself if the stress has been that intense for you. So post-traumatic stress disorder is one thing that can result from chronic or very, very intense trauma exposure. There's also something called acute stress disorder. And in acute stress disorder, the symptoms look a lot like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but they don't last as long. And then there is secondary traumatic stress. And secondary traumatic stress is a little bit about what I was talking about before, the idea that you don't necessarily have to be in the front line and exposed to a trauma to suffer from the stress of it. So it is hearing details, and those things start to take a little bit of a toll on you. All of the work that we do can cause us to have something called compassion fatigue. And while that doesn't sound like a very nice condition to have, it's not the worst thing in the world. People who develop compassion fatigue develop that because they have empathy to understand or feel what the people that they're working with are feeling, so they can engage and really connect with patients or peers or even family members. And compassion fatigue is not the end of the world, but it is something that can be managed. Compassion fatigue's kind of the mantra is when helping hurts. So when you're there helping someone else, sometimes that takes a toll on you. And then finally, there's burnout. That's the big bad thing to happen to us, right? That's just emotional exhaustion, disengagement. Burnout causes you to feel like what you signed up for isn't what you're doing anymore, and you're having trouble finding meaning in the work that you're doing, having trouble staying engaged, and finding fulfillment in that work.
Does burnout come from compassion fatigue?
It can. Burnout can can evolve from compassion fatigue. But the thing you want to know about that is it doesn't have to. That's not a terminal diagnosis, right? So compassion fatigue is something that we may get. We may notice symptoms of that, but it doesn't mean that we're going to go to burnout. We can apply some good self-care and slow that process down and maybe even reverse that process. One other thing that I want to talk about that has been a kind of a catchword or phrase over these past months is the notion of moral injury.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing to think about and to realize that people are dealing with. The definition of moral injury is perpetrating or failing to prevent or even bearing witness to acts that really go against our deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So what we see as the way the world should be, how we think things should be, aren't happening that way, and we have to operate in a world that some of those decisions go against our better judgment or our moral beliefs. Moral injury is trauma's moral dimension, so it doesn't feel good, but it's a thing we have to cope with as we're making decisions about who gets care, how to use resources, all those kind of things.
Where does grief play into all of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. Grief is sort of the overlay of all of this. When you go through things that are tough to deal with, you begin to realize that what should be or could be isn't always what we get. And so there's a sense of loss. There's a sense of this isn't right. I thought I'd be able to come home from work and spend time with my kids, and now I'm coming home from work and I'm isolating, or I thought that the work that I did, if I was good enough at that job, I could save people, right? And sometimes that isn't happening, and that can cause a lot of grief, to realize that what we thought and hoped we had control over might not be attainable, and we're dealing with some loss in a lot of different ways. So helpers work extends even to home. I kind of alluded to that just a second ago when I talked about coming home and the way we get to interact with our families, the way we get to connect with our friends socially. All of those things, long work days, the social distancing that we're trying to figure out how to make work for us, cause even additional stress for ourselves, and they cause stress for our families. Our families and our friends worry about us. They know the work we do. They see the information on the news or hear things, and they want to protect us and take care of us. But we go to work every day and we do a really good job. And it's okay to reassure them that we're taking good care of ourselves too.
So is there a way to quantify the effects of all this work on us?
Yeah, there is. There are lots of different assessment tools. The one that we are using most frequently and that people are saying they're feeling pretty comfortable with, getting some good information from, is called the Professional Quality of Life Scale. And this assessment is a very easy survey. It's just a one-page survey that you rate how you're feeling about different things. The results of that are scientifically validated, and it gives you a really nice picture of the cumulative effects of your work. So it'll tell you about your level of compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress. It'll tell you about your compassion satisfaction. I mean, that's what we go to work for, right? Compassion satisfaction. And it'll even tell you a little bit about your level of burnout. And we'll include a link to this professional quality of life scale at the end of this presentation.
So professional quality of life scale is a good tool for anyone to use to find out just how well they're handling stress then?
Oh yeah, and the thing about this scale is it's not a pass or fail. So that's a really important thing. I think sometimes people are afraid to take a test like this because they think, I don't want to know the answer. The reality of it is it gives you kind of a temperature of where you're at. And if you take this test now, or this survey now and find that maybe your compassion fatigue is a little high, then you can do some things about that. This is a great assessment to take maybe once a year on your anniversary date or on your birthday, just to see how your self-care is going.
So it's important for us as helpers to really look at the impact compassion fatigue and burnout, post-traumatic stress, moral injury and grief have on our well-being.
Yeah. Just like we notice things and attend to the issues of the patients we serve and the people around us, the people we care about, we need to use those skills to look at ourselves and make sure that we're taking good care of ourselves. And so the big takeaway from this session is the skills that you've learned from We Care, from the Look, Listen, and Link, or other clinical skills that you've learned to be compassionately present to your patients, are also the very same skills that you can use to take good care of yourself, to notice what you need and apply that self-care to stay well.
To access the Professional Quality of Life Assessment Scale, go to Ascension's Response and Recovery resource page.